Well, when you got up this morning, you were thinking, I'm going to learn about entrepreneurship. It's quite amazing what else you've learned today, haven't you? You've learned how to project, you've learned how to speak, you're also learning how to sing. You're a fabulous audience. You should give yourselves a round of applause for that. You don't think so? You guys are good, really. Anyway, after that most interesting musical session, we get back to the business of the day. This fireside chat on the subject, the world is not enough. It asks some difficult questions. How can small businesses reach out to global markets more effectively? This talk will provide insights on how to do exactly that based on lessons learned from effectively developing and promoting this in the OAS context. Please join me in inviting on stage Mr. Neil Parson and Mr. Guru Bhat. This session is brought to you by CAMS and Pro.
Can you all hear me? All right. So the previous session is going to be a hard act to follow unless Ambassador Parson wants to break into song at some point in our session. I don't think we're going to have any music here. So ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure and an absolute privilege, to be honest, to share the stage with somebody who has dedicated such a huge part of his life to causes that are incredibly worthy and has spent a lifetime bettering the human condition. Please give a big round of applause to Ambassador Parson.
Thank you.
So incidentally, Ambassador Parson is making his first trip to India, and I'm very pleased that it happens to be to the wonderful city of Chennai. So, Ambassador, so we were having, I would argue that there has never been a better time to be alive. How many of you agree to that statement? Awesome. I actually was hoping that I'll see every single hand up here, but nonetheless, I guess after a lunch hour, with the carbohydrates settling in, it's difficult to generate that kind of enthusiasm. Because if you look around us, technology has brought about change of an exponential nature. We have the world around us changing in incredible ways, sometimes in dramatic ways, sometimes in subtle ways, but unquestionably in impactful ways. And I would say that the role of entrepreneurship has never been as strong as it is today. So in that context, Dr. Parson and I were having a chat outside, and he had some really interesting perspectives on entrepreneurship as it stands today. Dr. Parson, given your body of work in the public realm, what does, let's start at a very big picture view. What does the word entrepreneurship signify to you?
Thank you, Guru, for the question. And first of all, let me say thank you very much to the organizers of this event. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And let me give a disclaimer very early. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. Brian Lara is my neighbor. I will say hi to him on your behalf. And unfortunately, I speak with a very heavy Caribbean accent. So if you don't understand, I will attempt to slow it down for you. But the question is an interesting one. What is entrepreneurship to me? When I hear the word entrepreneurship, Star Trek comes to mind. Literally, it's going where no man has gone before. I think of creativity. I think of risk. I think of vision, and I also see a concept from where I sit of the non-traditional concept of what entrepreneurial activity, entrepreneurship really means. You check the dictionary; it will suggest someone who puts his own capital on the line to leverage an opportunity with risk involved. And I see it probably from a problem identification point of view, somebody who is able to look at a situation, identify a problem, and come up with a solution for it, and in so doing, a product or service that will win them customers. So an entrepreneur plus capital equals product plus consumers, customers equals business. And I'm giving you that angle simply because very often the entrepreneur sees his existence from a startup point of view. And the success stories, at least I have seen in the Western Hemisphere from the Americas point of view, are those who really started the concept of entrepreneurial thinking from a growth point of view. So it's beyond the startup phase. And I think all of this to say in the context of the non-traditional concept of entrepreneurial activity is sustainable entrepreneurship with social capitalism, acting with entrepreneurial thinking with a sense of sustainable development and responsibility in mind. And it's something I feel, and I hope many of the budding young minds and not so young minds venturing into the world of entrepreneurial activity would bear in mind the whole concept of sustainability and the greater good, doing good while doing well.
Thank you. Thank you for that perspective, Ambassador Parson. And it was remiss of me to not mention this till now. Do feel free to add your questions to the debate. I think there's a Twitter hashtag that's up on stage prominently, #TiECON Chennai 2016. Please do tweet your questions, and we will have a curated list of questions that I can address as we reach the fag end of this conversation. So moving on from there, Dr. Parson, one question that I like to talk about is, if we were to look at the broader macroeconomic climate in the world today, it is characterized by a reduction in big spending, whether it is governments or large enterprises. And in general, the efficiency gains that have preceded us in the last 30 years, coupled with an overall climate that is declining in terms of economic activity and profits. So the tendency for established players to really invest has, I think, been constrained. Whereas if you look at the entrepreneurs, they have been responsible for quite a bit of growth. So what is your perspective on the role of entrepreneurship in job growth and overall development?
That's a very good question. First of all, let me just put the Western Hemisphere into perspective for you. India, from my understanding, is projected by 2020 to grow at about a rate of about 5.7%. Relatively speaking, when you look at the West, the rate of growth is considerably slower. And just to put, for those of you who may not be familiar, if you take the entire population of the United States, Canada, and you go down from Canada all the way down to Chile, you're looking at a population of approximately 990 million people. If I remove the US from the equation, you're looking at about 630 million people. That region is projected to grow at a rate of about 1.5%. In fact, there was negative growth for the past 5 years or so. We're only seeing evidence of improved growth, and it's projected to get to that 1.5 by the year 2017. That's an important figure in lieu of the fact that it is still the highest contributor in terms of employment from the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. Now, there's a big difference between an MSME and a startup, as we know, but one leads to the other, inevitably. And we're looking at about 70% of Latin America and the Caribbean contributing from MSMEs to the overall GDP of the hemisphere. But the employment is close to 65%. So there is a great deal of employment opportunities. In fact, young companies have been the biggest contributor to employment in the United States for the past 25 years. But a couple of things are changing. People still use the word globalization. In my respectful view, I think the word is antiquated. When you look at the behavior of some of our major economies, we have gone from a period of sovereignty, nationalism, to regionalism, for example, in the form of some of the ALBA countries in South America, Central America, to globalization. And what we're actually seeing now from a macroeconomic standpoint is from globalization, the next phase is regionalization. Economies are now contracting into their own respective areas. A very classic example of this, the latest regional body to be formed, it's a body called the Alliance Pacifica. All the South American countries that are washed by the Pacific Ocean have formed themselves into its own economic space. That heralds a new way of thinking. And it's a way of thinking that any young entrepreneur ought to be aware of, because what we are also seeing in Latin America particularly is a movement away from the notion of capitalism towards the notion of talentism, where people are beginning to spot talent rather than looking for raw forms of capitalism. So the days of low-cost production, for example, it's declining. What is actually increasing is the concept of knowledge-based economies coupled with human capital development. And that's a very serious notion, because it also suggests, in very fundamental terms, our education models worldwide. We have been hearing the concept of STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, etc. Absolutely important. But recent studies have shown, in many instances, the traditional models of educating society with the ultimate purposes of employment actually somewhat stifles creativity rather than unleashes creativity. And the root of entrepreneurial activity, as you would think, is innovation. The step before that is creativity. The step before that is the human imagination. So the question now is, how do we look at development from a holistic standpoint, from an education standpoint? I have the privilege, from where I sit as Secretary for Development of the OAS, we convene ministerial meetings in labor. We convene ministerial meetings in education. I was in Mexico last fall, I believe. And one thing stood out very clearly when we had all the ministers of labor around the table, is their overall consensus that there's a dysfunctional gap between the demands of labor and the supply of education. It goes back again to the contributor to overall employment. And you brought up the question of development, and if I may touch on that issue, all the countries of the world, 193 countries, all signed in New York last September their commitments to international development. Post Agenda 2020, we are now heading towards Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals. And again, it goes back to one's understanding as a young entrepreneur, what is your value added to this end? How do you take what your ambitions are in terms of evolving a company and a startup, and being civic-minded enough to link that to the overall concept of development? So these are some initial thoughts. I would also say that a great part of the responsibility of startups in particular is creating a harmonizing environment where there's proximity and intense interaction, enough to almost facilitate an ambience of beyond tertiary education, quaternary education, almost subspecialized learning to unleash creativity.
Thank you, Dr. Parson. I think many of the entrepreneurs in the audience should be galvanized by this sense of purpose, that they are in it not just to create a business and make money, but also to add value to society through the kind of development that you're talking about. So while in general there's a lot to lament about, but one also has to be cognizant of the fact that there's a lot to celebrate in the world today. One of these things that I've been noticing myself is the kind of acceptance of inclusion as a trait that is worthy of focus and effort to increase. So in all spheres, I've noticed that, for example, my own company is is centered around the concept of financial inclusion. There are various other forms of inclusion that many other companies are trying to promote. So in this regard, around the broader concept of inclusion, which in a sense is orthogonal to entrepreneurship, are there any connections that you can draw between entrepreneurship and inclusion as a trait that is worthy of focus?
I'm very happy you asked that question, because in fact, the motto of the Organization of American States is more rights for more people. And wherever I go, I advocate for access to rights and equity across the board. And a big part of, in fact, the civic-minded responsibility of an entrepreneur is the concept of inclusion. How do you actually add value to the concept of social development while engaging in creating value and making profit? And inclusion is a very broad term that really looks at the vulnerable in society. I speak of people with disabilities. I speak of the aged and the aging population. I speak of the indigenous populations. I speak of women, youth, particularly. I saw reference being made to Lego earlier. Right now, we are working on a very interesting project in several countries with Lego. And I mention Lego for a reason. We have, for example, at the OAS, we have built about 5 what are called pop-up schools. We have the ability to put up a school literally in 48 hours. And the concept of inclusion, for example, next week in Peru, Lego will be doing a project down there, and a big part of the indigenous population, they don't speak Spanish. They don't speak English. Their native tongue is Quechua. So when you have a big company like Lego actually creating online training in Quechua, which is extremely expensive, of course, to convert all of that, it also suggests a sense of corporate social responsibility of like-minded companies, and that's also responsibility of entrepreneurs in terms of their own thinking. If we touch on the issue of women in particular, migrants, when you look at Silicon Valley, 50% of the success stories coming out of Silicon Valley was built on the immigrant population. Migrants absolutely are part of the concept of inclusion. Women, I will touch on women particularly. Women, and no offense to any gentlemen in the audience, please, but women, I think, women represent 52% of the population of the Western Hemisphere. And a society cannot develop, a society cannot progress if 50% would be left behind.
Big round of applause to that thought, ladies and gentlemen. More power to women and entrepreneurs.
Thank you. And we have seen a great increase in the number of women participating, especially in government. In fact, over the last 3 to 5 years in the Western Hemisphere, we have had the President of Argentina, Kirchner. We have had the President of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff. We have had the President of Costa Rica, Chinchilla, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. We have had 5 or 6 women leaders, the very first time happening in the Western Hemisphere.
Maybe on November 8th, that number will grow by 1.
And studies have shown, in fact, I'll give you one statistic, which is very interesting. Goldman Sachs conducted a study, and they calculated that if women and men, there was parity in terms of their participation in society, the GDP of the United States will go up by 9%. The GDP of the EU will go up by 13%. The GDP of Japan will go up by 16%. So social inclusion is a must, and it's part of the economic development model and, of course, the sustainable development model going forward.
Excellent. So, just latching on to one of the quick things that you mentioned there, the fact that Silicon Valley was primarily fueled by migrant aspiration and ambitions. I'm sure during the course of your career, you've met a lot of Indians of varying shades of ambition and ability. And the question that intrigues me is, when we look at entrepreneurship and the climate in India, which has turned remarkably positive in the last few years, thanks primarily to organizations like TiE. What is your view on the role of the diaspora? We've got 2 things I feel that are really going for us here in the local ecosystem. One, we have access to a diaspora that has proven itself around the world. And secondly, we have inherent strengths in the ICT industry that we should probably be looking to leverage. So in that context, would you have some words around the role of the diaspora, and in particular, how the local entrepreneurs can piggyback on our success in the past couple of decades around ICT?
Absolutely. The diaspora has an absolutely important role to play, not just to incentivize entrepreneurial activity, but just for overall economic development in most societies. If I'm to touch on India particularly, I've had the absolute pleasure of interacting with many, many members of the diaspora from Silicon Valley, go across the country during my work over the last 6 years. There are 2 or 3 challenging issues that one has to bear in mind. One, very often I find, and this may not be only for India, but I've also seen it in the Caribbean, society's ability to receive their talent in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the capacity, the technical capacity in government, in private sector, at the level of institutions, has often been a challenge. And as I was discussing with you earlier, I've also seen where some cultural subtleties have also come into play. I was making the point earlier to Guru in a private conversation that I have actually seen where certain traits that a member of the, who would leave a country and go elsewhere in a host country to add to their own development, they often reculturize to a point. And very often those cultural values, when you return to your country of origin, it becomes an issue in terms of one's ability to function optimally and really add value to the conversation. And of course, diaspora members bring capital. And my experience has always been, I've never had a case where a member of the diaspora is not willing to come back and add value. Not once.
Excellent. So just to give you a little added color to what Ambassador Parson was saying. So he made a couple of interesting points about his stint in India so far, which happens to be his first. He said that seldom has he landed in a place that has in some way made him feel at home right away. And, I was very touched, Dr. Parson, that you felt this way about coming to Chennai. And secondly, the other thing that he said is that one of the character traits that he sees in abundance with the people that he has interacted with here is that really rare and, in my opinion, extremely endearing quality of humility. So a big round of applause to all of you for exhibiting these traits and impressing somebody like Dr. Parson. Thank you. So one of the things that around the world, we have to realize that barriers continue to fall. And as Thomas Friedman once famously noted in a book by the same title, the world is flat, and I'd argue that it's getting flatter by the day. So in this context, entrepreneurs, I think today have an unprecedented opportunity to attack global markets. And the platforms that we have in place today in terms of technology as well as regulatory environments seem to be getting friendlier by the day to achieve this kind of an objective on the part of the entrepreneurs. So in your capacity representing the OAS in particular, and maybe with your experience around the world, what would you say about the enabling environment for entrepreneurs, and any advice that you might have for them to attack markets like Latin America, like the Americas in general? What kinds of advice you might have to them in terms of capitalizing on either regulatory structures or even the culture? Some thoughts that you might be able to share on that would be really useful for the audience.
Sure. With pleasure. I mean, you're absolutely right. The preface to your question is spot on. Over the years, it has gotten easier. It has gotten cheaper. Development costs have gone down. I think we all could argue the internet has really created almost an open source for many of the endeavors that we wish to engage in, but there are some challenges. When you look across the 35 countries, if I'm to include Cuba, of our hemisphere, and I'm not including the small islands of the Caribbean, there are 28 small islands and substantively 35 countries, there's a high level of regulatory asymmetry. There are issues of, there are infrastructural issues, including ICT infrastructure. We have movement of people issues. We have really contrasting labor disputes going on. We have to look at the issues of, in many instances, there's political stability. And you started this conversation by making a point, and I want to touch on that point. You ask how many of you are grateful to be around today. And let me just tell you this, ladies and gentlemen, in case you weren't aware of it. In the year 2016, this is the most peaceful our planet has ever been in hundreds and hundreds of years. It's the most peaceful. And I think that's a point we need to appreciate, because we could not have had this conversation in context. And one of the most peaceful areas of the world is actually the Western Hemisphere. Solid democracies, political stability, general economic stability. So it's a welcoming environment for this sort of initiatives. But I would tell you that language is an issue. Most of the 22 of the 35 countries speak Spanish. So it will be a bit of a language challenge to engage the region. Brazil, for example, is almost totally Portuguese. And then we have hundreds of native tongues. So language will be an issue. There are some cultural sensitivities. I was explaining to Guru earlier. In many instances in countries of the Western Hemisphere, given the great level of humility I see with the people I've met here, arrogance in the West is welcomed. And in many instances, arrogance highlights one's intolerance to mediocrity. But you may frown on it, but there are some subtle cultural sensitivities that we need to be aware of and engage it. And they're not rate-limiting steps necessarily, but there's a potential for it to be an opportunity if you angle it correctly.
Sure. No, that's a very, very valid point. So going back to one of the things that we were talking about, Dr. Parson, if you look at the innovation ecosystem, it depends on a certain capacity for innovation that needs to be built up from the ground up. So in context of entrepreneurship, I think one of the levers that it undoubtedly depends on is a certain level of skill building and talent building that needs to be invested in. Any thoughts that you want to make in this regard around talent and skill building as an important pillar for entrepreneurship to finally stand on? And what kind of role do entrepreneurs have in aiding that process to help themselves?
Well, I could probably peg that question to the job development question. I mean, to have a job, you need a certain set of skill sets. And in absolute terms, entrepreneurship is linked to talent and skill building. But the challenge would be how, in the ecosystem of entrepreneurship, do you unleash creativity? I think that's the thinking, and creativity would naturally lead to a set of skills that will be developed over time as we proceed. I would also suggest that there was a gentleman by the name of Daniel Foisberg from Mabon College, and he had a very interesting theory. He suggests to optimize talent and skill building in an entrepreneurship ecosystem, you need the 5 Ps. You need a place where there's proximity and intense interaction with all the actors, including social actors in the system. We need potential, particularly startups that already exist with a revenue stream. And they would have gone through the process of weeding out, and studies have shown up to 20% of those who survive the weeding out phase have the potential for a rapid trajectory, and hence talent building. We need people. And very often, again, studies have shown it takes about 15 to 20 committed people to actually reculturize the way the ecosystem is operating. And that will naturally lift the talent pool over an extended period of time. And of course, you need purpose. Not everybody has to be an entrepreneur, but we all need to understand our role as stakeholders as part of the bigger ecosystem. And of course, we need perspective on all of this. Document the quick wins, so you can incentivize others to be part of the system going forward. So absolutely, there's a role, and I think a big part of all of this is sharing of best practice. When you learn, you share. It's what we do via the development cooperation model that we have at the OAS. We allow, for example, small business development centers, SBDCs across the hemisphere to talk to each other and connect them. So I think that's a critical part of actually allowing the tide to rise so all boats shall rise.
No, and I think an organization like TiE here is doing yeoman's work in actually enabling the exact thing that you're talking about. So time to just shift my focus to some of the questions that have come in from the audience. And the credit for the first question goes to a gentleman called Anand. So the question is, what are the options for small companies in Chennai to reach SMBs, small and medium-sized businesses in the US?
Good question. I would very happily like to help you with that. In fact, within the secretariat in which I am secretary for, we have 3 major political and policy dialogue opportunities. One, we do something twice a year called the America's Competitiveness Exchange. We identify individuals who have an interest, and we physically arrange trips. We were in Ottawa recently, San Diego. We're heading to Texas in a couple months, where we actually create these opportunities to engage directly with talent as well as with MSMEs in the cities that we host. Secondly, we have every 2 years, all the presidents and prime ministers of the Western Hemisphere meet in a forum called the Summits of the Americas. The next Summit of the Americas is in 2018 in Lima, Peru. When the presidents and heads of government meet, they then determine mandates that they wish to see the hemisphere implement. One of those mandates is to enhance the overall competitiveness of the hemisphere. So we have what is called the America's Competitiveness Forum. My secretariat is a technical secretariat to deliver on the America's Competitiveness Forum. And again, the finest minds in entrepreneurship, the finest minds in MSMEs development, in competitiveness meet and hold dialogue. I would be more than happy to extend an invitation to the membership of TiE to be part of that process. And the third thing is, annually, we hold high-level authority meetings on MSMEs. So it's where the various competitiveness councils, innovation councils of the hemisphere meet at a technical level to discuss exactly these exchanges and these opportunities. And once again, I would be, it's such a pleasure being here because it really enhances the opportunity for South-South cooperation and enhancing opportunities for collaboration, cooperation, if not collusion, to improve the partnerships that we have.
Thank you, Dr. Parson, and we will certainly take you up on the offer. So I'm mindful of the time I have left on the clock, but I have an extremely well-articulated question by Deepak, and I quote, "How do you balance profits and societal good? Oftentimes it becomes a difficult dichotomy to straddle." Very good question, Deepak. Thank you very much. If you're in the audience, big thanks to you. So, Dr. Parson, I think it's a philosophical question in a way, but I think it goes to some of the things that you have articulated in your positions on, for example, the agenda for 2030 around sustainable development and societal good over just material profit.
Deepak, I will answer that question based on an example. I have had the privilege of, a few months ago, I went to Spain. And in fact, I went to a part of Spain, very north of Spain, called San Sebastian in the Basque country. And I saw a model there, and I visited there for a reason. Their modeling of how they were operating in an innovative ecosystem was a very interesting one. It's where there is an organization called Orchestra, and it's funded partly by the government, partly by academia, partly by civil society, partly by private sector and NGOs. Orchestra's role is being a street captain, an independent third party with the full authority to manage results-based management in terms of the performance of entrepreneurship and innovation in society there. And they hold government and all the other stakeholders accountable for the metrics that they measure over time. And a big part of that feeds back into training and development opportunities and engaging in what they term smart specializations. And yet the attempt at smart specialization goes beyond the concept of promoting clustering, but it holds society accountable for doing just that, balancing value, profit, and civic-minded responsibility for societal development. It's probably one of the finest examples I've seen of how. And I hope that answers the question in terms of an example.
Thank you very much. And as the clock counts down, I want to thank all of you for being an extremely engaged audience. Dr. Parsons, there was a video which introduced Ambassador Parson, and I'm not kidding when I say that we could have gone through 45 full minutes just looking at the kind of accomplishments that he has been able to do in his lifetime. One of the things that when I met him face to face for the first time, I was struck by how young he looks for somebody who has done so much in his life. It's been a pleasure and a privilege, Dr. Parson. The city of Chennai, the state of Tamil Nadu, and the country of India wishes you Godspeed in your effort to change the world to be a better place. Ladies and gentlemen, please do indulge me one more time to give him a big round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Parson.
Thank you.